On March 18, 1944, somewhere over northern France, the German fighter pilot from Munich had encountered his fair share of American bombers in his 3 years of combat. B-17s, B-24s, and even the new B-29s he had heard about, but this one looked different. Shorter, almost unattractive compared to the sleek flying fortresses. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio, laughing at the pregnant duck approaching the area. The American B-25 Mitchell bomber was flying alone, separated from its squadron, and limping along at 8,000 feet with one engine smoking. It seemed like easy prey for two Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The pilot from Munich smiled beneath his oxygen mask. Another kill painted on his fuselage. He had already downed 6 bombers, and this would be the easiest yet. He signaled his wingman with a wing waggle and pushed the stick forward, diving from 12,000 feet. The American bomber grew larger in his sights. But something struck him as odd. The nose looked different from other bombers. Instead of the usual greenhouse nose for the Bombardier, this one had a solid front painted olive drab. Several dark holes dotted the nose cone. Gun ports, he realized, but how many could they possibly fit in that small space? Lieutenant Jack Morrison from Akron, Ohio, watched through the top turret as the 2 German fighters began their dive. He was 26 years old, married 14 months, with a baby girl he'd never met except in photos. The B-25J Mitchell they flew had been modified in ways the Germans hadn't seen before. The Army Air Forces had learned hard lessons over Europe. Bomber crews needed more firepower, especially for head-on engagements. So they did something radical. They removed the Bombardier's position entirely and replaced it with a wall of machine guns. Not 2, not 4, but 12 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, plus 2 more in blisters on each side of the fuselage. Morrison keyed the intercom. The pilot, Captain Bill Anderson from Cedar Rapids, had already seen the enemy. So had Sergeant Tony Russo from Brooklyn manning the nose guns. Russo, 22, a former butcher's apprentice, had the steadiest hands Morrison had ever seen. Those hands now gripped the control for 12 synchronized machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's 9,600 rounds per minute of half-inch lead projectiles, all converging at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. The German pilot had performed this kind of attack dozens of times. Dive from above, come in fast at a 15 degrees angle, fire a burst at 500 yards, and break away at 200 yards. The closing speed would be over 500 miles per hour, too fast for the bomber's gunners to track effectively. He had seen American gunners panic, spraying rounds wildly into empty air. This attack would be no different. At 800 yards, he lined up his approach. The bomber hadn't changed course. Good. They were frozen in fear. At 600 yards, he prepared to squeeze the trigger. That's when he noticed something strange. Small flashes from the bomber's nose. Not 2 or 4, but a constellation of muzzle flashes. Then, the air in front of him became solid. That's the only way to describe what 12 synchronized .50 caliber machine guns do to the space ahead. The tracer rounds, one every 5th bullet, created lines of light so dense they seemed like a solid wall of orange fire. Between each visible tracer were 4 more invisible rounds. The German pilot had perhaps half a second to process this before the first rounds reached him. A .50 caliber bullet is half an inch in diameter and weighs about 1.5 ounces. When it leaves the barrel, it's traveling at 2,900 feet per second. At 300 yards, it still has enough energy to punch through an inch of steel. The Messerschmitt's armor was designed to protect against .30 caliber rounds from defensive positions. Not this. The first burst hit the German fighter in the engine. 3 rounds pierced the engine block. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. 2 more rounds shattered the propeller hub. Another hit the cockpit floor, missing the pilot's legs by inches. The engine seized immediately, and the propeller windmilled uselessly. The German pilot, experienced enough to know when he was beaten, rolled inverted and dove away, trailing black smoke, searching for a place to land. His wingman, watching from above, couldn't believe what he had just seen. The American bomber had created a cone of death extending 300 yards from its nose. Not random defensive fire, but a concentrated stream that no fighter could fly through and survive. The wingman climbed back to altitude, leaving the monster to someone else. In the B-25's nose compartment, Sergeant Russo watched the German fighter dive away. His hands hadn't even started sweating. The entire engagement had lasted maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds of concentrated firepower that had turned the predator into prey. The 12 guns had fired perhaps 800 rounds in total. They carried 4,000 rounds for the nose guns alone. Plenty left for anyone else who wanted to try. The modification had been Captain Anderson's idea, based on reports from the Pacific, where B-25s were used for low-level strafing against Japanese shipping. The solution was simple: remove the bombardier position. They had dedicated bombers for that role. Instead, turn the Mitchell into a flying gunship. The nose could accommodate 12.50 caliber guns, plus 4 more attached to the fuselage. Add the 2 guns in the top turret, 2 in the waist positions, and 2 in the tail, and the bomber became a formidable weapon, designed to survive the hell of aerial combat. In the tail, the B-25 Mitchell had 18 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Nothing in the Luftwaffe's arsenal was designed to withstand that kind of firepower. Captain Bill Anderson glanced at his instruments. The No. 2 engine was still running roughly due to flak damage sustained over the target, but it would hold. They had gotten separated from their squadron during a German fighter attack near Rams, and now they were on their own, trying to make it back to England with only 1.5 engines. The encounter with the 2 Messerschmitts would be reported, and Anderson knew that within hours, every German fighter squadron in France would know about the B-25 with a solid nose and its wall of lead. 3 days later, Major Klaus Steinberg from Hamburg didn't believe the reports. He had been flying combat missions since the Battle of Britain and had over 200 sorties and 43 confirmed kills. He knew American bombers and their weaknesses. The report claimed a single B-25 had driven off 2 experienced pilots with something called a solid nose gun package. Steinberg figured it was propaganda, or that the pilots had been inexperienced, perhaps frightened by a lucky burst of defensive fire. He was leading a flight of 4 Focke-Wulf 190s on patrol near Abbeville when they spotted a formation of American bombers returning from a raid on railroad yards in Belgium. Mostly B-26 Marauders, flying in their standard box formation at 15,000 feet. But trailing behind, lower and slower, was a single B-25. Steinberg smiled. This would be a good opportunity to show the younger pilots how to properly attack a wounded bomber. The Mitchell was flying at 12,000 feet. Both engines were running, but clearly struggling to maintain altitude. Steinberg could see the tail number, the olive-drab paint worn down to bare metal in places from hundreds of hours of combat. The crew had to be exhausted and probably low on ammunition after their bombing run. He signaled his flight. He would attack first from the front quarter, demonstrate the proper technique, and then the others could finish it off. Staff Sergeant Ray Kowalski from Pittsburgh manned the top turret, scanning the sky constantly. At 24 years old, built like a linebacker, he had worked in the steel mills before enlisting. He'd been flying combat missions for 8 months, had seen his friends' planes explode, and watched crews floating down in parachutes over enemy territory. He knew the statistics. The average life expectancy for a bomber crew was 15 missions. They were on their 31st. He spotted the 4 German fighters high and to the right, about 3 miles out, climbing for altitude. The sick feeling in his stomach wasn't from the turbulence, for fighters against one damaged bomber rarely ended well. But their B-25J wasn't just any bomber. They had proven that over and over in the past 2 months. The modifications had turned them from prey into something else entirely. Not quite a predator, but certainly not an easy target. Captain Mike Thompson from Denver was flying this mission, Anderson's regular replacement when he was on leave. Thompson was 31, had been a crop duster before the war, and had hands like a surgeon with nerves of steel. When Kowalski reported the fighters, Thompson's voice over the intercom sounded casual, like he was discussing the weather. He told the nose gunner, Corporal Jim Sullivan from Boston, to ready the nose battery. Sullivan, 19, the youngest on the crew, had reflexes that made him deadly on the gun controls. Major Steinberg began his attack run from the 2 o'clock high position, the classic angle that gave him speed and a good approach, making it difficult for the bomber's guns to track. He'd approach at a 30 degrees angle, fire his cannons at 400 yards, then break away. The Focke-Wulf's 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns would tear the Mitchell apart. He pushed the stick forward, entering a shallow dive, speeding to 300, then 350, 400 miles per hour. The bomber loomed larger in his sights. At 1,000 yards, he saw the Mitchell's nose, solid, just as a report had said. Multiple gun ports were visible. So, the story was true. They had modified the nose. No matter. Even 8 machine guns couldn't stop a properly executed fighter attack. At 600 yards, Steinberg prepared to fire. That's when Sullivan opened up. The sensation was like flying into a thunderstorm made of lead. The tracer rounds created a tunnel of light that Steinberg seemed to be flying directly into. His windscreen was struck in 5 places simultaneously. Something hammered into his left wing, then his right. The control stick shook violently in his hands. A round punched through the canopy, showering him with plexiglass. Another destroyed his gun sight. 2 more rounds hit the engine, and he immediately smelled smoke. Training kicked in. Steinberg rolled hard left, diving away from the barrage of fire. In his entire combat career, he'd never experienced anything like this. The American bomber had turned the air in front of it into a killing zone. His Focke-Wulf had taken at least a dozen hits in less than 2 seconds. Oil pressure was dropping, engine temperature rising, smoke filling the cockpit. He jettisoned the canopy and prepared to bail out. The 3 remaining German fighters watched their leader fall away, trailing smoke and flames. Steinberg's parachute blossomed white against the green French countryside below. They'd all seen the wall of tracers, the impossible density of fire the bomber had produced. The wingman, a young lieutenant from Berlin on his 5th combat mission, felt his mouth go dry. He'd been taught that American bombers were slow, clumsy targets, but this one had turned the tables completely. The B-25 Mitchell was now a flying fortress, equipped with 18 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Nothing in the Luftwaffe arsenal could withstand that kind of firepower. Captain Mike Thompson kept the Mitchell steady, watching the 3 remaining German fighters circling at a respectful distance. They were staying outside of effective gun range, probably deliberating their next move. Thompson knew they'd try again. German pilots were nothing if not persistent, but they'd be more cautious now. They'd likely attempt to coordinate their attack from multiple angles simultaneously, but that was fine. The B-25J had guns pointing in every direction. Let them come. Just as Thompson had anticipated, the 3 Germans split up, climbing to different altitudes and positioning for a coordinated strike. 1 high, 1 level, 1 low, designed to overwhelm the bomber's defenses and force the gunners to choose targets. It was a solid tactic against the standard bomber, but the Mitchell's nose gun could engage multiple targets in rapid sequence, and the top turret, waist guns, and tail position were fully manned. The 3 German fighters dove in from different angles. Sullivan engaged the high fighter first, sending a stream of lead toward it. The German pilot, seeing the tracers coming for him, broke off early, his shots wide. Kowalski in the top turret handled the level attacker, twin .50s hammering away. The waist gunner, Sergeant Paul Martinez from San Antonio, dealt with the low fighter. For 15 seconds, the air around the B-25 was filled with crossing tracers, the bomber at the center of a web of fire. When it was over, all 3 German fighters had disengaged. One was trailing smoke, another had a windscreen so shot up the pilot could barely see. They had managed to get maybe 20 rounds into the Mitchell, mostly small caliber and nothing critical. The bomber, however, had fired over 2,000 rounds and was still flying, still dangerous. The 3 German pilots exchanged glances through their canopies and, without a word, turned eastward, heading home. Let someone else deal with this flying fortress of guns. Word spread quickly through the Luftwaffe. The Americans had created a monster, a bomber that could defend itself with unprecedented firepower. Within a week, standing orders were issued. B-25s with solid noses were to be engaged only with superior numbers and extreme caution. Better to let them pass than to lose fighters to that wall of lead. But not everyone received the message, or perhaps they chose not to believe it. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber from Stuttgart, 22 years old and still without a confirmed kill after 3 months of flying combat, saw an opportunity when he spotted a lone B-25 over Normandy on April 2, 1944. Weber's flight leader had warned him about the modified Mitchells, but Weber figured the stories were exaggerated. No bomber could carry that much firepower. He peeled off from his formation and dove into attack. Technical Sergeant Joe Novak from Cleveland, manning the nose guns that day, was 27 years old and had been a machinist before the war. He understood mechanical systems like others understood music. He had personally supervised the installation and alignment of their 12 nose guns, spending hours adjusting the convergence point until all 12 streams of bullets met perfectly at 350 yards. He had painted a small sign above his gun position, "Abandon hope, or ye who enter here." Novak watched a single German fighter begin its run. A young pilot, Novak could tell by the approach. Too steep, too fast, and no deception. The kid was trying to make his mark with an easy kill. Novak almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He waited until the fighter was at 400 yards, then squeezed the trigger. The 12 guns roared in unison, the vibration shaking the entire nose compartment. The tracer streams converged perfectly, creating a cone of destruction that the German fighter flew directly into. Weber had perhaps a quarter of a second to realize his fatal mistake before the concentrated fire tore his Messerschmitt apart. The left wing separated first, followed by the tail. The engine exploded. The cockpit disintegrated. What had been a fighter plane became a cloud of aluminum confetti falling toward the French countryside. Weber never had a chance to bail out. Captain Anderson, back from leave and flying this mission, watched the destruction in his mirror. He had seen the nose guns in action countless times by now, but it still amazed him. 12.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a level of firepower more suited for a naval vessel than an aircraft. Each gun were precisely aligned, and their combined rate of fire created a stream of bullets so dense that nothing could survive flying through it. They had turned the B-25 from a medium bomber into something entirely new, a gunship that just happened to carry bombs. The modifications hadn't come without costs. The 12 nose guns and their ammunition weighed over 2,000 pounds, which meant the Mitchell's bomb load had to be reduced and fuel consumption increased. The guns generated so much heat that special ventilation had to be installed to keep the nose compartment from turning into an oven. The recoil from all 12 guns firing could even slow the bomber's airspeed by 10 miles per hour. But none of that mattered when they could create a wall of lead that no fighter pilot dared challenge. By May 1944, the modified B-25JS had become legendary among both American and German pilots. American fighter escorts began deliberately leaving gaps in their coverage around the gunship Mitchells, knowing they could handle themselves. German pilots would issue warnings over the radio when they spotted the solid-nosed B-25s, often opting for easier targets instead. The kill ratio was extraordinary. In just 3 months of operations, the gunship B-25s had shot down or damaged over 40 German fighters, while losing only 2 of their own. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hoffman from Milwaukee, commanding the 447th Bombardment Squadron, had been a strong advocate for more conversions. His report to the 8th Air Force headquarters was blunt. The B-25J gunship configuration has proven that the best defense is overwhelming offense. German fighter pilots have learned to fear these aircraft. Request immediate conversion of all available B-25s to the gunship configuration. His request was denied. The modifications were costly and time-consuming. The added weight affected the range and bomb load. The Army Air Forces needed bombers that could still bomb, not just serve as gunships. But Hoffman's squadron kept their modified Mitchells and continued to prove their worth on every mission. On May 15, 1944, over the P de Colla, Captain Ernst Müller from Cologne led a squadron of 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, all experienced pilots with multiple kills. They had been vectored to intercept a formation of American bombers heading for V-1 launch sites along the French coast. Müller, with 38 confirmed kills, was considered one of the Luftwaffe's best bomber hunters. He knew about the modified B-25s, had read the reports, and even spoken to pilots who had encountered them. While he believed the threat was real, he felt it was manageable with the right tactics. The American formation appeared through broken clouds at 14,000 feet, with B-26 Marauders in the lead and B-25s trailing. Müller studied them through his binoculars, spotting 3 solid-nose variants among the regular Mitchells. He quickly devised a plan: ignore the gunships and focus on the standard bombers and Marauders. There was no need to tangle with the heavily armed B-25s when easier targets were within reach. But Sergeant Danny O'Brien from South Boston, manning the nose guns of one of the B-25JS, had other plans. O'Brien, 23 years old with red hair and freckles, had a temperament that matched his Boston upbringing. He'd grown up in tough neighborhoods, where you learned to hit first and hit hard. When he saw the German fighters positioning to attack the other bombers, ignoring his Mitchell, it irked him on a personal level. They were dismissing him as not worth their attention. He would show them otherwise. O'Brien convinced his pilot, Lieutenant Tom Washington from Tallahassee, to break formation slightly and angle toward the German fighters. It wasn't an attack run exactly, but positioning to put them within range of the nose guns if the Germans came after the other bombers. Washington, 28, a former math teacher with an expert understanding of angles and vectors, saw O'Brien's reasoning and agreed. They could provide covering fire for the other bombers, using their massive firepower defensively. Muller noticed the B-25 shifting out of formation, but didn't initially understand why. When he led his fighters and against a group of standard Mitchells, he quickly found out. O'Brien opened fire at maximum range, 800 yards, walking his streams of tracers across the path of the attacking fighters. The Germans had never expected a bomber that wasn't even under attack to fire back. The psychological effect was immediate. Seeing that wall of lead reaching out toward them, even at long range, caused 3 German pilots to break off their attacks prematurely. One German pilot, younger and more aggressive, pressed on. As he closed in, O'Brien shifted his fire, all 12 guns swiveling to track the fighter. At 500 yards, the accuracy improved dramatically. Round began striking the Messerschmitt. Not many at first, but enough to get the pilot's attention. By 400 yards, the fighter was taking multiple hits. The pilot broke off and dived away, trailing smoke from his engine. He never even got within effective firing range. The engagement lasted less than a minute, but it changed everything. Muller realized the Americans had transformed these gunship B-25s into something like aerial destroyers, protecting the bomber fleet the way naval destroyers protected convoys. They didn't have to wait to be attacked. They could reach out and strike any fighter that threatened the formation. The 12 nose guns gave them a reach and hitting power that no fighter pilot wanted to test. 3 days later, the Luftwaffe issued new tactical guidelines. B-25 with solid nose configurations were to be classified as heavy defensive platforms and engaged only when absolutely necessary. The preferred tactic was to avoid them entirely and focus on other targets. If engagement was unavoidable, attack should come from directly above or below, staying outside the cone of fire from the nose guns. Even then, pilots were warned to expect heavy defensive fire from other positions. The Americans kept improving their tactics. 2. The modified B-25Js began flying in specific positions within formations, placed where their nose guns could cover the maximum number of other bombers. They became the shepherds of the bomber fleet, the guards that kept the wolves at bay. German fighter pilots learned to recognize them from miles away. That distinctive solid nose became a warning sign, signaling find another target. Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez from El Paso had a different job on the B-25J. As a flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, 25 years old, was responsible for keeping the B-25's guns running smoothly. A mechanic before the war, he had learned the importance of maintaining the 12 nose guns, which were temperamental beasts prone to jamming if not properly cared for. Each gun fired at a slightly different rate, which could create harmonic vibrations that could shake mountings loose. The heat from sustained firing could warp barrels, cause ammunition to cook off, and even start fires if hydraulic fluid leaked onto hot metal. Rodriguez had developed an obsessive maintenance routine. He cleaned and checked every gun after each mission, personally inspecting each ammunition belt for damaged rounds that might cause jams. He adjusted the gun mountings daily to compensate for metal fatigue caused by vibrations. He even developed a firing sequence that O'Brien could use to prevent overheating. Fire 8 guns for 3 seconds, then switch to the other 4 while the first 8 cooled, and then back to all 12 for the kill shot. His meticulous attention to detail paid off on May 28, 1944, when they encountered something new, a full squadron of Focke-Wulf 190 specifically hunting gunship B-25s. The Germans had developed new tactics, approaching in wave from multiple angles to overwhelm the B-25 defensive firepower. The first wave came in high and fast, 4 fighters in trail formation. O'Brien engaged at maximum range, forcing them to alter their approach. But while the nose guns were occupied, another 4 fighters attacked from beam positions. This was where the full armament of the B-25J came into play. O'Brien handled the high attackers with the nose guns, while Sergeant Mike Patterson from Detroit, manning the top turret, engaged the beam attackers with his twin .50s. The waist gunners, Corporals Tim Lee from San Francisco and Bobby Jackson from Atlanta, added their fire. The tail gunner, Sergeant Mario Benedetti from Newark, watched for anyone trying to sneak in from behind. The Mitchell became a sphere of flying lead, with guns firing in every direction. The German fighters pressed their attacks with determination, but the volume of defensive fire was overwhelming. One Focke-Wulf took a burst from the nose guns that removed most of its right wing. Another had its cockpit shattered by fire from the top turret. A third pulled away with both engines on fire after flying through the combined fire from the waist positions. In 90 seconds of combat, the single B-25 had shot down 2 fighters and damaged 3 more, while taking only minor damage itself. But the Germans were adapting. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, while the world focused on the beaches of Normandy, Captain Hans Richter from Vienna led an experimental attack on a gunship Mitchell. He had studied every after-action report, analyzed the geometry of the nose gun coverage, and identified what he believed was a blind spot. If approached from directly below at a 70 degrees angle, the nose guns couldn't depress enough to engage. The belly of the B-25 was relatively undefended, with no gun positions covering that angle. Richter's theory was put to the test over the English Channel. He spotted a lone B-25J struggling back from a mission, one engine feathered, falling behind the formation. It was the perfect target for Richter's approach. He dove below the bomber's altitude, then pulled up sharply from directly underneath. The nose guns couldn't bear on him. The top turret couldn't depress far enough, and the waist guns had limited downward visibility. For a few seconds, Richter had a clear shot at the bomber's belly. His cannon shells tore into the Mitchell's underside, puncturing fuel tanks and severing control cables. The bomber shuddered, losing altitude. Richter pulled away, expecting to see it go down. But the crew of the B-25J wasn't ready to quit. Lieutenant Colonel James Foster from Richmond, 42 years old, the oldest pilot in the squadron, was flying that day. He had been flying since 1925 and had more hours in his logbook than most pilots had in their lives. He felt the hits, knew they were bad, but also knew that B-25s were tough. Foster managed to keep the Mitchell in the air through skill and sheer determination. He'd lost rudder control, had fuel streaming from punctured tanks, and the remaining engine was overheating. But they were only 40 miles from the emergency field at Tangmei. He ordered the crew to prepare for a crash landing while he nursed the bomber home. O'Brien stayed at the nose guns, ready to discourage any fighter that might try to finish them off. Rodriguez worked frantically to transfer fuel from the punctured tanks, trying to prevent a fire. They made it to Tangmei on fumes and prayer. Foster brought the Mitchell in hot, with no flaps, no rudder, using differential engine power and aileron control to maintain what resembled control flight. They hit hard, bounced twice, ground loop when the left gear collapsed, and came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. The crew evacuated quickly, expecting a fire, but Rodriguez's fuel transfer had worked, and they all walked away. The Mitchell was written off, but it had survived an attack that should have destroyed it, bringing its crew home against impossible odds. Richter's report on the successful attack method spread through the Luftwaffe, but it came with a warning. The attack required perfect execution and iron nerves. You had to fly directly under the bomber's guns, trust that you were in the blind spot, pull up at the exact angle, and score hits in the few seconds you had before the bomber's gunners adjusted. Most pilots who tried it found that the danger of flying directly under the bomber's fire was too great. The B-25J gunship had earned a fearsome reputation by July 1944. German pilots would radio warnings when they spotted the solid-nose variants, often opting for easier targets. Despite the reduced bomb load, American crews actively sought assignment to the formidable aircraft. Fighter escorts would greet them when they spotted the distinctive solid noses. Ground crews painted elaborate nose art celebrating their immense firepower, Dragon's breathing lead, Gatling guns with wings, and the Grim Reaper clutching a dozen sides. One Mitchell, named Leadstorm, proudly displayed 43 small German crosses beneath its cockpit, each one marking a fighter destroyed or damaged by its guns. The Germans had their own nickname for these bombers, Holland Maskinen, Hell Machines. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated that engaging a gunship B-25 head-on was 12 times more dangerous than attacking a standard B-17 from the same angle. The math was brutally simple. A B-17's nose had 2.50 caliber guns, possibly 4 if you counted the top turret. The B-25J had 14 forward-firing guns, the 12 in the nose and the top turret. That meant 7 times the firepower, packed into a much more concentrated arc. But beyond the numbers, there was a psychological toll. Sergeant Willie Turner, the tail gun on Alabama Hammer, AB-25J, described it best in a letter home. At 21, Turner had been a coal miner before the war, familiar with both danger and fear. "The German fighters are afraid of us now," he wrote. "You can see it in how they fly. They come in all aggressive, but when they see our nose, see all those gun barrels, they hesitate. That hesitation is all we need." Danny opens up with the nose guns, and suddenly the fighter's running away, not even trying to shoot back. We become the thing they check for before attacking anyone else. The fear was well-founded. On July 18, 1944, a single B-25J shot down 4 German fighters in one mission. The bomber, nicknamed Seattle Slugger, was flown by Major Robert Chen from San Francisco, one of the few Chinese-American pilots in the European theater. His nose gunner, Sergeant Bill Garrett from Louisville, had developed an almost supernatural ability to lead targets. The 4 kills came in 2 separate engagements, each time with German fighters testing whether the gunship's reputation was deserved. The first 2 kills involved Bf-109s attempting a coordinated attack from 1 o'clock high. Garrett engaged the lead fighter at 600 yards, walking his tracers into its path. The German pilot, seeing the wall of lead coming, tried to roll away but flew directly into the stream. The concentrated fire tore through the fighter's fuselage just behind the cockpit. The tail section separated completely, and the rest of the aircraft tumbled out of control. The second 109, witnessing his leader's destruction, broke off without firing a shot, but made a mistake of crossing in front of the B-25. Garrett smoothly shifted fire, catching the fighter broadside. The .50 caliber guns at 300 yards turned the Messerschmitt into scrap metal in less than 2 seconds. The second engagement came near the target at the railway yards at Amy. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s bounced the formation from above, diving through the top cover. One lined up on Seattle Slugger, probably not recognizing it as a gunship variant until it was too late. Garrett opened fire at maximum range, creating his signature wall of lead. The German pilot, committed to his dive, tried to barrel through, passing 500 yards, then 400, then 300. The tracers hit, sparking off the fighter's engine and cowling, shattering the canopy. At 200 yards, the Focke-Wulf's engine exploded, and the pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just as his fighter plowed into a French wheat field. The 4th kill was almost accidental. A damaged Bf-109 trying to disengage from another bomber flew across Seattle Slugger's nose at about 400 yards. Garrett fired a short burst, more of a warning shot than an attack, but with 12 guns firing, even a short burst meant 200 rounds. The fighter took at least 20 hits, began streaming glycol from its cooling system, and immediately dove for the deck. The engine seized 2 miles later, forcing the pilot to bail out at low altitude. His parachute barely had time to deploy. Major Chen's after-action report was matter-of-fact. Engaged enemy fighters, for destroyed, no damage to aircraft, returning to base. But the impact of this mission rippled through both air forces. 4 kills by a single bomber in one mission was almost unheard of. The gunship B-25s weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were actively hunting any fighters that came too close. The Luftwaffe's response was to essentially declare the gunship B-25s off-limits unless absolutely necessary. A directive dated July 22, 1944, instructed fighter pilots to avoid engagement with B-25 aircraft exhibiting the solid nose configuration unless specifically ordered or when no alternative targets were available. It was an admission of defeat, acknowledging that some American bombers were simply too dangerous to attack. But war doesn't always give you the luxury of picking your battles. On August 3, 1944, Lieutenant Wolfgang Becker from Dusseldorf found himself alone, separated from his squadron, low on fuel, with a B-25J directly in his path back to base. At 20 years old, and on his 8th combat mission, Becker had never encountered a gunship Mitchell before. He'd heard the stories, but figured he had no choice. He needed to get past the bomber to reach his airfield. Maybe he could dash underneath it, avoid those infamous nose guns. Corporal Johnny Washington from Memphis was manning the nose guns that day, substituting for O'Brien had been sidelined with food poisoning. So Corporal Johnny Washington from Memphis, a 19-year-old with the hands of a saxophonist, was manning the nose guns. Before the war, Washington had been a jazz musician, with long, delicate fingers that could coax melodies from brass or, as he discovered, death from machine guns. His nearly musical sense of timing and understanding of rhythm and lead proved invaluable in combat. He watched a lone German fighter approach at low altitude, clearly attempting to slip under them. He depressed the nose guns as far as they would go, but the angle was wrong. The fighter would pass below their field of fire. Washington called it out to the pilot, Captain Steve Anderson from Portland. Without hesitation, Anderson dove the Mitchell, angling downward to give Washington a better shot. It was a risky move, diving toward an enemy fighter, but it worked. Now the German fighter was directly within the cone of fire from the nose guns. Washington opened up at 300 yards, all 12 guns roaring. The concentrated fire created a curtain of lead that the fighter flew directly into. Becker's Messerschmitt came apart like it had hit an invisible wall. The engine separated from the fuselage, both wings folded backward, and the cockpit disintegrated. What had been a fighter became a cloud of debris falling into the English Channel. Becker never knew what hit him. The kill was Washington's first and only. 2 days later, he was transferred to another crew when O'Brien returned to duty. But that one engagement earned him a Distinguished Flying Cross and a mention in Stars and Stripes. Memphis Jazz Man plays deadly tune on Nazi fighter, the headline read. It was the kind of story that made the legend of the gunship Mitchell even larger. By late August 1944, with the Allies breaking out from Normandy and advancing across France, the role of the B-25 gunships began to shift. With fewer German fighters challenging the bomber streams, the Mitchells were increasingly used for ground attack missions. The 12 nose guns, which could destroy a fighter in seconds, proved just as effective against trucks, trains, and troop concentrations. The gunships would come in low, sometimes as low as 50 feet, and unleash their devastating firepower on German columns trying to retreat eastward. Lieutenant David Kim from Los Angeles, flying a B-25J named Dragon's Breath, described one such mission in his diary. They encountered a German convoy stopped at a crossroads near Fours, with around 30 vehicles, including tanks and half-tracks. Kim brought the Mitchell in at treetop height while his nose gunner, Sergeant Carlos Mendez from San Diego, prepared to engage. At 200 yards, Mendez opened fire with all 12 guns. The effect on the convoy was catastrophic. Trucks exploded, men scattered, and even tank crews abandoned their vehicles rather than face that concentrated fire. In a single pass, lasting maybe 10 seconds, they destroyed or damaged half of the convoy. But the Germans weren't passive targets. They learned to position anti-aircraft guns specifically to target the low-flying gunships. On September 2nd, 1944, Hell's 12, a B-25J that had survived 43 missions, was caught by concentrated flak near Metz. The nose compartment, where Sergeant Tony Palmer from Chicago manned the 12 guns, took a direct hit from an 88mm shell. Palmer was killed instantly, and the nose guns were destroyed. Without their primary armament, the Mitchell was just another medium bomber, damaged and vulnerable. The pilot, Captain Ben Franklin from Philadelphia, managed to nurse the crippled bomber back to Allied territory, but Hell's 12 would never fly again. The loss hit the squadron hard. Every gunship crew knew they were priority targets. The Germans had placed bounties on them, promising extra leave for anti-aircraft crews who brought one down. Fighter pilots who managed to destroy a gunship Mitchell were awarded Iron Crosses immediately. The solid-nose B-25s had become symbols of American industrial power, proof that the Allies had created a weapon the Germans couldn't counter effectively. But they kept flying, kept fighting. On September 15, 1944, during the failed Operation Market Garden, B-25 gunships provided close air support for paratroopers trapped at Arnhem. Flying through intense ground fire, they came in at rooftop height, using their nose guns to suppress German positions. Sergeant Mike O'Connor from Buffalo, the nose gunner on New York Minute, fired over 3,000 rounds in a single mission, helping to clear a path for British paratroopers trying to reach the bridge. The mission came at a cost. New York Minute took over 100 hits from small arms and light flak. O'Connor was wounded twice, shrapnel in his shoulder and leg, but stayed at his guns. The pilot, Major Tom Wilson from Seattle, flew the last 30 minutes with no hydraulics, barely any control, and blood from his own wounds making the control stick slippery. They made it back to base, counted the holes, and counted themselves lucky to be alive. Wilson received the Distinguished Flying Cross, while O'Connor spent 2 months in the hospital before returning to duty. By October 1944, the Luftwaffe had largely been swept from the skies over Western Europe. The gunship B-25s had played a significant part in that victory. Official records credited them with 73 confirmed fighter kills and over 100 damaged. Unofficial estimates were much higher, but numbers didn't tell the full story. The real victory was psychological. They had taken a bomber and turned it into something that fighters feared. They had reversed the predator-prey relationship that had defined aerial combat for so long. Captain Paul Anderson from Minnesota, who had flown 37 missions in a gunship Mitchell, put it simply in a letter to his wife. We changed the rules. For 3 years, fighters hunted bombers. We were always on the defensive, always reacting. Then we put 12 guns in the nose, and suddenly we weren't prey anymore. We were dangerous. We could reach out and touch them before they could touch us. You could see it in their eyes. Well, not literally, but you get the point. They'd come in all aggressive, and then they'd see our nose, see all those guns, and hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation is death. The ground crews recognized the significance as well. Master Sergeant Roy White from Dallas, crew chief of Texas Thunder, had been working on bombers since 1942. These gunship Mitchells, he said, they were different. Regular bombers. You're always patching holes, fixing damage from fighter attacks. But the gunships? They came back clean more often than not. The fighters just wouldn't engage them. And when they did, well, we'd be painting another kill mark on the nose instead of patching bullet holes. November 1944 brought new challenges. Desperate to turn the tide, the Germans introduced jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262. These aircraft were 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. Conventional wisdom held that jets were unstoppable, and no amount of defensive firepower could counter their speed advantage. The gunship crews weren't so sure. On November 28, 1944, they got their chance to prove otherwise. Captain Jack Thompson from Denver was flying Colorado Crusher on a mission to bomb rail yards near Frankfurt when two Me-262s appeared. The jets made a high-speed pass of the formation, their cannons blazing. Most bombers could only watch, as the jets were too fast for their gunners to track. But Thompson had positioned his B-25 perfectly, anticipating the jet's attack path. Sergeant Pete Wilson from Portland, manning the nose guns, had maybe 2 seconds to engage. With 12 guns, though 2 seconds was more than enough, he led the target by what seemed like an impossible distance, firing where the jet would be rather than where it was. The wall of lead intersected perfectly with the Me-262's flight path. The jet flew through the concentrated fire for less than half a second, but that was enough. Multiple .50 caliber rounds struck the jet's right engine. The Me-262 began trailing smoke, its speed advantage gone. The pilot broke off, diving away and trying to return to base on one engine. He didn't make it, having to bail out 10 miles short of his airfield. It was the first jet fighter damaged by a B-25 gunship, proving that even the newest German wonder weapons weren't immune to concentrated firepower. The second Me-262 wisely decided not to press its attack and disappeared into the clouds at 600 miles per hour. Wilson received the Silver Star for the engagement, with a citation noting his exceptional gunnery skills against superior enemy aircraft. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had broken through American lines in the Ardennes, and every available aircraft was thrown into the battle. The gunship B-25s were assigned close air support missions. Their firepower was desperately needed to stop German armored columns, flying in weather that would normally ground all aircraft. They came in low through snow and fog, their 12 nose guns tearing into German vehicles and troops. On December 23rd, the The weather briefly cleared, and the full might of Allied air power was unleashed. Captain Bill Roberts from Houston led 3 gunship Mitchells against a German panzer column near Bastogne. They came in line astern, each B-25 firing its nose guns in sequence. The first Mitchell destroyed the lead vehicles, blocking the road. The second hit the fuel trucks in the middle of the column. Roberts, flying the third aircraft, systematically worked over the trapped vehicles. His nose gunner, Sergeant Jim Davis from Little Rock, fired over 4,000 rounds in 3 passes. When they were done, 27 German vehicles were burning, and the column was completely destroyed. But the Germans fought back viciously. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and desperate. Houston Pride, Roberts's aircraft, took massive damage on the third pass. The nose compartment was hit repeatedly, and Davis was wounded in both arms but kept firing. The right engine was shot out, and the left wing was on fire. Roberts managed to keep the Mitchell airborne long enough to reach American lines, where they belly-landed in a snow-covered field. The crew survived. Davis would lose his left arm but live. Houston Pride was finished. Another gunship lost to German desperation. By January 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. German resistance was crumbling, and their air force was virtually extinct. The gunship B-25s had done their job, perhaps too well. There were simply no more fighters to shoot down, no more need for their specialized firepower. Some B-25s were converted back to standard bomber configuration. Others were reassigned to ground attack duties, using their 12 nose guns against targets of opportunity. February 12, 1945, marked the last air-to-air kill by a B-25 gunship in the European theater. Brooklyn Brawler, flown by Lieutenant Sam Cohen from New York, encountered a lone Focke-Wulf 190 near Cologne. The German pilot, probably on one of his first missions, made the fatal mistake of attacking head-on. Sergeant Mike Murphy from Boston, the nose gunner, immediately opened fire. The German pilot didn't stand a chance. The 12.50 caliber guns tore the fighter apart, and it exploded mid-air. Cohen's report simply stated, "Engaged enemy aircraft, 1 destroyed." The kill was a final chapter in a long and storied legacy of the B-25 gunship in the skies over Europe. Captain Paul Anderson from Minnesota, who had flown 37 missions in a gunship Mitchell, shared his thoughts in a letter to his wife. "We changed the rules. For 3 years, fighters hunted bombers. We were always on the defensive, always reacting. Then we put 12 guns in the nose, and suddenly we weren't prey anymore. We were dangerous. We could reach out and touch them before they could touch us. You could see it in their eyes. Well, not literally, but you get the point. They'd come in all aggressive, and then they'd see our nose, see all those guns, and hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation is death." The ground crews felt the same. Master Sergeant Roy White from Dallas, the crew chief of Texas Thunder, had worked on bombers since 1942. He said, "These gunship Mitchells, they were different. With regular bombers, you're always patching holes, fixing damage from fighter attacks. But the gunships, they came back clean more often than not. The fighters wouldn't engage them, and when they did, we'd be painting another kill mark on the nose instead of patching bullet holes." November 1944 brought new challenges. The Germans, in desperation, introduced jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262. These aircraft were 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had. Conventional wisdom said the jets were unstoppable, that no amount of defensive firepower could counter their speed advantage. The gunship crews weren't so sure. On November 28, 1944, they got their chance to find out. Captain Jack Thompson from Denver was flying Colorado Crusher on a mission to bomb rail yards near Frankfurt when 2 Me-262s appeared. The jets made a high-speed pass of the formation, their cannons blazing. Most of the bombers could only watch as the jets were too fast to track, but Thompson had positioned his B-25 perfectly, anticipating the jet attack. Sergeant Pete Wilson from Portland, manning the nose guns, had only 2 seconds to engage. With 12 guns, 2 seconds was all he needed. He led the target, firing where the jet would be rather than where it was. The wall of lead intersected perfectly with the Me-262 flight path. The jet flew through the concentrated fire for less than half a second, but that was enough. Multiple .50 caliber rounds struck the jet's right engine. The Me-262 began trailing smoke, its speed advantage gone. The pilot broke off, diving away, trying to make it back to base on one engine. He didn't make it, bailing out 10 miles short of his airfield. It was the first jet fighter damaged by a B-25 gunship, proving that even the newest German weapons weren't immune to concentrated firepower. The second Me-262 wisely broke off and disappeared into the clouds at 600 miles per hour. Wilson would receive the Silver Star for the engagement, cited for his exceptional gunnery skills against superior enemy aircraft. December 1944 saw the Battle of the Bulge. German forces had broken through American lines in the Ardennes, and every available aircraft was thrown into the battle. The gunship B-25s were assigned close air support missions. Their firepower needed to stop German armor columns. Despite weather conditions that would normally ground aircraft, they came in low through snow and fog, tearing into German vehicles and troops. On December 23rd, the weather briefly cleared, and the full might of Allied air power was unleashed. Captain Bill Roberts from Houston led 3 gunship Mitchells against a German panzer column near Bastogne. They came in line astern, each B-25 firing its nose guns in sequence. The first Mitchell destroyed the lead vehicles, blocking the road. The second hit the fuel trucks in the middle of the column. Roberts, flying the third aircraft, worked over the trapped vehicles systematically. His nose gunner, Sergeant Jim Davis from Little Rock, fired over 4,000 rounds in 3 passes. When they were done, 27 German vehicles were burning, and the column was completely destroyed. But the Germans fought back fiercely. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and desperate. Houston Pride, Roberts's aircraft, took massive damage on the third pass. The nose compartment was hit repeatedly, and Davis was wounded in both arms but kept firing. The right engine was shot out, and the left wing was on fire. Roberts managed to keep the Mitchell airborne long enough to reach American lines, where they belly landed in a snow-covered field. The crew survived. Davis would lose his left arm but live. Houston Pride was done. Another gunship lost to German desperation. By January 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. German resistance was crumbling, and their air force was virtually non-existent. The gunship B-25s had done their job, perhaps too well. There were simply no more fighters to shoot down, and no more need for their specialized firepower. Some B-25s were converted back to standard bomber configuration. Others were reassigned to ground attack duties, using their 12 nose guns against targets of opportunity. February 12, 1945, marked the last air-to-air kill by a B-25 gunship in the European theater. Brooklyn Brawler, flown by Lieutenant Sam Cohen from New York, encountered a lone Focke-Wulf 190 near Cologne. The German pilot, probably on one of his first missions, made the fatal mistake of attacking head-on. Sergeant Mike Murphy from Boston, the nose gunner, opened fire immediately. The German pilot didn't stand a chance. The 12.50 caliber guns tore through the fighter, and it exploded mid-air. Cohen's report simply stated, engaged enemy aircraft, 1 destroyed. The kill marked the final chapter of a storied legacy of B-25 gunships in the skies over Europe. Their impact extended beyond combat. The gunship Mitchells proved that innovation could overcome traditional limitations, that defensive weapons could become offensive tools, and that the bomber-fighter dynamic wasn't fixed. They influenced the design of post-war aircraft, leading to the heavily armed gunships like the AC-47 and AC-130 that would dominate battlefields in Vietnam and beyond. The greatest legacy, however, lay in the minds of the men who flew them. They had gone to war expecting to be hunted, to be victims needing protection. Instead, they became hunters themselves, predators in bomber clothing. They took 12.50 caliber machine guns and turned them into a psychological weapon as powerful as any bomb. Technical Sergeant Joe Novak, the flight engineer from El Paso who kept those 12 guns running, perhaps summed it up best in a letter to his son years later. We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought fear itself. Every time those 12 guns opened up, creating that wall of lead, we were saying, we're not afraid of you. You should be afraid of us. And they were. My God, they were. And that feeling, that moment when the hunters became the hunted, that's what I remember most. Not the killing or the dying, but that moment when we stopped being afraid. The numbers tell one story. 42 aircraft modified, 73 confirmed kills, hundreds of ground targets destroyed, thousands of rounds fired. But the real story was in those moments when German pilots saw that solid nose, saw those 12 dark holes, and chose easier prey. The real victory was in making the hunters hesitate, turning defense into offense, and proving that American ingenuity could turn any challenge into an advantage. Today, only a handful of B-25 gunships survive in museums around the world. Visitors walk past them, perhaps reading a placard or taking a photo. Few understand what those 12 guns meant, what that solid nose represented. It wasn't just firepower. It was defiance. It was taking a bomber and making it something that fighter pilots feared. It was American crews saying, "Come at us. We're ready." The last surviving nose gunner from the gunship Mitchells, Mike Murphy from Boston, died in 2019 at age 94. At his funeral, his grandson read from his diary, "They gave us 12 guns and told us to defend ourselves. We did more than that. We made the Germans defend themselves from us. Every time I squeezed that trigger, sending 20 pounds of lead per second into the sky, I was writing a message in traces. American bombers aren't victims. Not anymore. Not with these guns. Not with these crews. We changed the game, and the Germans never recover from that change." Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's most incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage.